This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is former chef turned seed hunter and gardener, Mitch McCulloch. Mitch applies his culinary knowledge when choosing and cooking with the produce he grows. Not only does he select the most diverse and interesting varieties, he gets creative with how he serves up his produce. His new book, The Seed Hunter, is properly inspiring if you're both a cook and grower and you want to get the absolute most out of your edible plants.
My background started as a chef. I was working in London at all different types of establishments, from cafes and pubs to restaurants and wherever else, you name it. And then I ended up starting my own catering business. And through that, we was looking to source the best ingredients. We saw a lot of other establishments that were, focusing on the provenance of meat and dairy and the fish, but nobody was really championing the vegetables. So when we had our catering business, we was also really looking to find high quality produce in terms of vegetables and fruits, and pretty much struggling to find anything locally grown to London that was organic or of good quality or of just different variety to begin with. And then, I was a chef for all of those years. And then, like many of gardeners that are out here today, that they found or rekindled a passion for growing food during COVID. I think it highlighted a lot of things for me during that period. And I decided to really go for it. I put down my chef's apron and picked up the garden hose and jumped into the world of gardening through that.
It shocks me, I think, because funnily enough, just about 10 minutes ago, I had a conversation with someone who's looking to source local produce in terms of fruit and veg, and they want stuff that's organic and maybe stuff that's a little bit out of the ordinary. And it is hard to do. And we're a nation of gardeners. I mean, why is it so difficult, do you think?
I think that there's multiple factors why sourcing local, good quality, unusual, whatever it may be. And the first one is access to land. It's so expensive and difficult. And so growing fruit or vegetables on that land, especially around cities or greenbelts, just isn't viable financially for many people. Two, I think there's a lack of knowledge and a lack of people that actually are willing and wanting to go and work on the land, although we did see that, but now there's definitely a shift towards more people searching for that kind of lifestyle, which then brings more jobs within it, but then they're still limited to these other factors. And then I think the supply and demand. A lot of these more unusual heirlooms, potentially they don't have good transportation qualities. Maybe their skins are a little bit too thin, or they're pretty fragile, or have a short shelf life. And these are the issues that we're facing because we're growing homogenized crops that are desirable for different traits that aren't necessarily going to be those ones that are reflected in the taste or the appearance. These crops are just being grown so they can be transported thousands of miles in a cheap way.
All very valid points, I think. So you mentioned obviously that you get involved in the actual growing now. So what is it that you do at the moment?
I've actually been traveling for I left England in December. I have been visiting various different countries all through Asia, South America, North America, Europe. And I've just been visiting, whether it be seed growers or farmers or small scale producers, and just learning about all different agricultural and farming systems in different climates and how that's embedded within different communities and cultures. But when I was growing, I had a kitchen garden to begin with. And when I started that garden, it was in September. And I was researching what could be grown at that time of year. And one of the things I could plant was garlic. And I was fascinated to discover that there was over 700 named varieties of garlic being grown worldwide, each posing their own different culinary uses, storage abilities, textures, flavors, you name it. There was just a whole plethora of things to be discovered within the world of garlic. And then that transcribed to all the different crops within the vegetable world. So with terms of growing, I actually learned of a method called no-dig. And I actually did start a garden when I was in my early 20s. My grandma went out shopping one afternoon on a Saturday. And I just dug up her whole garden and basically started an allotment. And when she come back, her jaw hit the floor. And she was a little bit annoyed to begin with. But after she started to see the produce come out and we was growing and we was eating some good stuff, she was enjoying it. But during that time, I was in my early 20s. I was a young man in London and I was swayed by the bright lights and wanting to go out and explore different things. And so that left a little time for my garden. And this method of no dig presented fewer weeds, something that I had a lot of issue with before in my previous garden. Having to do less watering when I was in my 20s, watering the garden every day was taking up my precious time, being able to go out and spend with my friends. So I learned about this no dig, which basically presented fewer weeds, less watering, healthier plants, and less work to begin with. So I implemented that no dig approach, and that's how I've been gardening ever since. And it's been fascinating for me to learn about soil health and plant health and how plants feed and how it's very different to what we believe in terms of having to fertilize plants. You feed the soil and not the plants, and the soil does all of the work. And so it was just a fascinating learning experience just from changing one simple aspect of gardening, which is to stop digging and to start mulching.
And I was very lucky to be sent a copy of your book, The Seed Hunter. And I have to say, it's a fantastic book, actually. And I really enjoyed it. And it's very inspiring if you are into growing your own food, because it's so in depth. Each variety that you've picked to talk about, you really sort of dig into the culinary uses and the cultural context, as well as the things that you include. What was the idea behind writing the book?
I think the main idea behind writing the book was the more I learned about these incredible plants, the more I realized that they was under threat due to a globalized food system. And we've lost something like over 70% of agricultural seed diversity due to the globalized food system. And that the future generations may never get to taste the delicious flavors from our past. And so my whole thing was like, I would like to champion and tell the stories to captivate other people's imaginations and passions to grow these crops and maintain this genetic gene pool we have of produce. And so with the book, it doesn't just go into growing the vegetables. It takes a whole leaf out of my chef career, not necessarily giving recipes, but like giving sort of snippets of information to unique or unusual dishes or tips and tricks that I've picked up along the way. And then the cultural significance with these crops are just fascinating. Every seed has a story to tell, no matter if it's a small story or incredibly touching story, whether it be from war-torn countries or from cultural indigenous communities. Or it could even be like a little old nana in Italy who's been growing a type of sauce tomato for the last 30 years, and she handed it down to her grandchildren and they still make pomodoro sauce with it. There's every single seed is just so sacred to somebody. And the more we move towards mechanicalized F1s or hybrids, we lose that passion and that culture, which is held safely, and the story is held safely within this seed.
You totally do that. You bring each one alive, and it is that context that you put it into and all that additional information that I think will really fire people up and get them interested in tracking down these varieties. That said, how easy is it going to be for people to source the varieties that you include in the book?
Sourcing some of those varieties in the book will be a challenge for sure, but for the most part, the vast majority of those seeds are available via different seed companies around the world. It might be a case of tracking down which companies have them or seed houses. And there is a QR code in the back of the book, which is a live document, which has 46 pages of seed sources and places where you can find different seeds. But tracking down seeds is a journey for somebody for themselves, going to seed swaps, finding blogs and forums and tracking them down is all part of the fun and all part of the experience. And then once you have these seeds, it's up to you whether you decide to save them or to pass them on, or it's up to the community of gardeners to make sure that we continue to spread and save and rejoice in these varieties.
Is there an argument to be made for celebrating your kind of local produce and the history in wherever it is that you are based, the history around kind of food growing as well in your community and in your bioregion?
Oh, absolutely. And I feel like for the most part in the UK, there's almost a huge lack of celebrating produce or coming together over produce. If you go to France or Spain or other countries, you will always see parties or festivals where everyone comes together for the strawberry harvest, everyone comes together for the cabbage harvest. In Japan, there's huge celebrations when they harvest radishes, for instance. And here in the UK, there is a lack of that. So I think we could start to rebuild that, whether that be through farmers markets or small farms that are having open days to celebrate the produce of local. But then again, it's not only just about local produce, it's about locally grown seed, because locally grown seed will be more adapted to the environment. It will have more disease resistance, but also keeping that variety grown in the local area really brings in the closed loop system, which is essential for a healthy food system.
I think probably you maybe need to be fairly organised if you are going to start propagating your own crops, saving your own seeds. Have you got any good tips for how people can document what they've done historically in the garden and the results, and what's good for what soil and what's been particularly successful? Because I think that's a challenge sometimes for people.
Yeah, it is a challenge. I mean, I definitely need to do more note taking myself. I just keep everything in my head, which is probably not the best advice to give, but that I kind of just am able to create a mental image of where my garden is and what's been planted and the dates that they've been sown at. But I understand that's not achievable for everybody. But yet a notebook, writing down when you sowed the seed, what date, perhaps you could even write a little mention of how the weather was that day, just other things, even your mood. And then you could look back on that and you could be like, oh, on the 27th of June last year, I sown some salad and it was raining. And then you could look back the following year and you could see not only the knowledge of what you've been planting, but other bits of information of the climate and where you planted it in the garden. Just note taking, I would say.
Thinking about the actual crops themselves, when I was reading the book, it kind of challenged me a little bit, because I think that I personally get used to seeing veg and fruit prepped and packaged in a particular way, so that when we grow our own stuff, sometimes it doesn't look quite how we expect it to look or how it's presented in, say, a supermarket. And I think because of that, we sometimes don't always use every part of the plant that we could. Do we have to be a little bit more open-minded when it comes to growing our own veg and what we do with it? And is there going to be a learning curve for some growers?
Well, absolutely. I mean, vegetables and plants, they're just like people, and they shouldn't all look the same or have this sort of look that they need to abide by. And that's the issue, is that we have this indoctrinated mindset of how produce looks like because of the way it's grown for the supermarket. And when you grow your own vegetables, you have the whole plant to work with. So a lot of recipes in Thailand call for coriander root. Now, you can't find coriander root for sale anywhere in the UK. I think I might have seen it once. Now, if you've grown coriander at home, you can pull the plant up and then use the roots in traditional Thai curry pastes, a product which you never would have been able to get hold of in the UK. And so it's not only about changing your approach, but actually realizing and understanding how much more choice we have when we grow our own food in terms of what we can achieve on the plate.
And I think that is a learning curve, because, as you say, you may not find that for sale and you may not realise that you can actually do that with that part of the plant. For example, radish seeds, I suppose they're a bit more well known now, but if you're radish bulbs, you can actually use the pods from it with the seeds in. So that's kind of one example. But if you didn't know this information, how can you find it out? How's a good way to explore this kind of additional information that we may not know?
Well, I think that's kind of what I did try to include in the book, because a lot of gardening books give you a lot of information of how to grow the plant, but not necessarily how to store or use it or prepare it. And so I did want to add those sorts of nods. So I think my book would be a great source of information for that. But then it's also, the modern lifestyle has not necessarily made people lazy, but we don't necessarily have enough free time to ourselves. And so one of the things that has been dramatically shaven down is the amount of time we spend in our own kitchens cooking. And so it's not necessarily about finding out more information. It's about experimenting yourself and spending more time in the kitchen with the produce and touching it, feeling it, smelling it. What happens if I cut it like this and roast it when it's small? What happens if I cut it when it's big and roast it? And just trying out different things. And we need to have a whole sort of cooking revolution as well as a growing revolution at the same time.
Yeah, that is such a good point for two reasons. A, I think, yes, we do need to be more brave and experimental when it comes to cooking, but also that what you said about the time issue, is it something that we could do perhaps even as like a hobby? If we're looking for something to do in our spare time, could this become something we do? We just kind of play with the produce and the food that we can grow.
Absolutely. Whether it be as a family, getting children involved, or even like with your partner. If your partner isn't that into cooking and you've got some fresh produce that you've grown, maybe that could excite your other half and get them into the garden and get them cooking. And as a family or as a couple or even on your own, it's a real good bonding experience. Like cooking alone is a great bonding experience for yourself because you're not being distracted by TV or radio or your mobile phone or social media. You're just there living in the moment. And as a family, what an incredible experience to be harvesting and experimenting and cooking and everyone trying out different things together.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's always searching for something to do that's promoting mindfulness or helping our mental health, our well-being. And there's this kind of obvious thing that's right in front of us that's connected to life that we could all kind of do, and relatively cheaply as well, I suppose.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Cooking together as a family is free. If you've grown the produce, you've obviously there is some financial input into it, but like that memory that you've also built is so valuable. And touching on mental health, our gut is directly linked to our brain. So if we are out in the garden, say we've been looking at a real juicy tomato ripening on the vine for a few weeks, and then the day finally comes when you pluck it off the vine and you bring it out of the garden into the kitchen and you slice it up and you make like a delicious fresh bruschetta or something like that, that is giving you a full sense of satisfaction, which is lacking in modern life. You've tended to that plant from seed to harvest. You've gone out there, you've waited until the perfect moment. You've then prepared it and eaten it. And where else in life can we find that full sense of satisfaction like that? It's really almost lacking everywhere.
So very true. So you mentioned that you've been traveling. I'm guessing you have found some things on your travels that you're going to be trialing when you get back to the UK. Is there anything you're particularly excited about growing or eating?
Oh, I don't know if I'll be coming back to the UK.
Oh, okay.
I've basically witnessed a lot of more friendlier climates for growing in other countries. And as somebody that is passionate about growing and vegetables and fruit, I would like to live somewhere where I could probably grow citrus and olives and a little bit more tropicals and stone fruits and reliably be able to grow avocados. So I'm actually probably not going to be growing in the UK, I doubt, but I have found some really exciting and interesting stuff from something called the cow's udder aubergine, or sometimes known as the nipple aubergine. And this is small yellow aubergine with one end is smooth and round like an egg, and the other end has these udder-shaped cylindrical things protruding out of the bottom. And I found that in South India, in Kerala, a man's garden called Abraham, who has a 3-generation-year-old spice garden where he has all different types of cardamom and black pepper and 24 different types of banana and bamboo that's striped like zebra print, and you name it, he's got it. Different types of cacao, coffee, just an incredible experience. And that's where I found this particular type of aubergine, this yellow skin, and it's traditionally used for pickling and to making into like a brinjal chutney, which would be served alongside curries, which provides like a sour, tart, and subtly sweet and spicy note for those traditional Kerala coconut curries.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I've got a strange question, and it's because someone emailed me today and said that they felt I ought to get someone on who's like an expert on tomatoes. And I thought, actually, I don't know why I hadn't thought of that sooner, because I love them and you've mentioned them a couple of times. Do you have a particular type of tomato that you would always go to, or are there a couple that you would suggest people try that might not necessarily be available to buy?
Oh, there's so many tomatoes out there. I wouldn't know where to start. I really like paste tomatoes, like to grow, because paste tomatoes are very, very tricky to find in the supermarkets or at farmers markets. And I love cooking with tomatoes. I love tomato curry, tomato sauce, you name it. I want to use it for roasting, baking. And so I tend to try and grow a lot of sauce tomatoes. And one I really like is the Amish paste brought to America by the Amish and grown out here still in the US by communities here. And it's one of the best canning and sourcing types I've ever tasted. Real thick, meaty center with very few seeds. That's perfect for making tomato sauce with. And in terms of like a slicing tomato or an eating tomato, there's one I like called Thorburns Terracotta. And this variety was thought to be lost for, I think, probably 60 to 100 years. And then the seeds were found in the freezer of I think it was the grandfather of a man called William Woys Weaver. And he basically brought this variety back to life. And it's called Thorburns Terracotta because it has this incredible dark terracotta skin. But then when you cut it inside, it's like a bicolored brown and green seed mass. And the flavor is smoky. It really does have like a smoky, rich, unlike anything I've ever tasted before, this tomato. It's really, really unique. And then maybe for a cherry tomato or like a smaller one, there's some modern varieties out there which are really cool and difficult to get hold of, like Brad's Atomic Grape or the Prairie Fire. That's a real small, sweet sort of mini plum type tomato. Absolutely delicious. One of the sweetest that I've ever tried. There's so many out there.
Thinking about like big questions with probably a lot of different answers depending on the day. Is there anything that you can think of where we're particularly missing a trick when it comes to growing it because it tastes so much better fresh than it does if you buy it?
There's quite a few crops. Carrots so much better when you grow them at home. Like just an incredible flavor which adds so much robust, rich, deep flavor to stews and sauces. And when eaten fresh in salads and coleslaws, you know, those carrots have such an earthy taste on them. You can actually really taste the ground on them. Celery, we've been completely void and robbed of the flavor to where now this vegetable has really fallen out of popularity. People don't even want to use them in their Bloody Marys as a swizzle stick anymore. But homegrown celery provides like this sort of sulfury taste, which really does add a lot of natural saltiness to dishes, and that's why it's used in mirepoix. Anything with high sugar content like melons and watermelons, if you've got a greenhouse and you're capable of growing those indoors, then you're going to probably, if you even just got a few fruits, it would probably be the best cantaloupe you've ever eaten.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned, your book is very inspiring, and I would urge people to get a copy of it because it is just great. I loved it so much, and I gave it to a friend to read who's really into food, and she was just like, wow, she was blown away by it because there's so much information in there. If people got the book, what would you kind of want them to do as a result of reading it? What would be your hope?
Oh, that's a great question. I hope that people that read my book, if they aren't gardeners, it would open the door for them to wanting to try and experiment with growing some of the varieties listed so they could, begin to taste and explore the world of heirlooms and what it has to offer. And if somebody was a seasoned gardener, maybe, or a market gardener, maybe they would think twice about where they sourced their seeds from and the varieties that they chose to grow and how they looked and symbolized those particular varieties. Because if you grow just a gardener's delight tomato, it's just a gardener's delight tomato. If you're growing a bean which was saved by the Cherokee Nation and they had to hide the beans amongst them as they was forced to walk through the Cherokee Trail of Tears, and this was like a sacred bean close to their hearts, then I believe that bean will be looked at in a completely different way to as a regular run-of-the-mill gardener's delight tomato. So it's about helping people to forge a connection to their food and the history behind their food, and how we're even capable of eating some of these varieties today is just because of the farming techniques and the selection work of our ancestors.
Thank you very much to Mitch for penning such a brilliant resource in The Seed Hunter, and thank you for listening. If you like this episode, I recommend checking out episode 287, Heirloom Vegetables, and episode 188, Hugh Richards on veg growing. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All podcast.